Hey guys, welcome back to Salvage Yard Stories. I'm Uncle Dave. A couple of weeks ago, I was driving here in Pella, Iowa, where I live, and I ended up seeing in a driveway a car I haven't seen in a really long time, a Plymouth Neon. It was in horrible shape, but it existed, which was crazy. And it made me think, how many cars did we grow up with that we remember growing up with, but you just don't see them at all? Not even like one or two occasionally. You don't see them at all. Well, one of the cars that I was looking at was the Nissan, the 1600 or the NX 2000. Little two-door coupe, came with a 2-liter motor or a 1.8-liter motor. It had T-tops. It was a fastback, but you could actually, from the dealership, order it so that it was like a 2-door wagon. And, 5-speed, 4-speed automatic. You don't see those anywhere. The last time I saw one was in Newton, Iowa at a salvage yard. Besides that, they're nowhere. Like, there's none of them. In high school, I had a buddy who had a Geo Storm. We remember Geo as a brand. Geo was sold under Chevrolet, but most of the cars came from manufacturers overseas. The Storm was actually the duplicate of the Isuzu Impulse. Well, they were good-looking little sports cars that were super cheap, $8,000 to $10,000. But one of the problems with those cars was they just absolutely rusted to pieces within years. And of course, the quality of the interior was absolute garbage. But it's just crazy because not only do you not see those cars driving around, if you go on eBay Motors, sometimes maybe one, but usually zero. There's just none. They're all gone. The quality was such garbage that they're all gone. Another vehicle that came to mind was the Ford Aerostar minivan. Some of you might remember that came about in the late 80s, went up to about 97. Rear wheel drive. You could get it with a 3-liter 6-cylinder or a 2.3-liter 4-cylinder. And then you could get a 4-speed automatic, but you could also get a 5-speed manual with the 2.3. So if you imagine an empty weighted van in the rear end that's rear wheel drive with a 2.0-liter 4-cylinder and a 5-speed manual transmission, that's unheard of today. But because it was competing with Dodge's Caravans that were front drive, they didn't sell as many, and they're nowhere. They're nowhere to be found. The craziest thing is I have a neighbor that used to work for the local college here, Central College. He was the head of the maintenance department that had an all-wheel drive Aerostar. It was all-wheel drive towards the end, and he's kept it up for years and years, but he finally said he has to retire it because there's no parts. He can't get parts for it anymore. Besides his, I don't see any of those around. My mother-in-law has a 96 Oldsmobile Aurora, and it's falling apart. It exists, but it's falling apart, and the only way that you can keep an Aurora on the road, I guess, is if you have money, because that's how they do it. But it's a piece of garbage, But sometimes we have to think to ourselves, was it really a piece of garbage? It wasn't the best quality to begin with, but nobody thought you'd still be driving a 2016 or a 1996 Aurora in 2024. Nobody figured that a car would last that long. But, people ask me questions like, why do those cars not exist anymore? Why are those cars completely gone? The Chevrolet Beretta, they made the Beretta in many flavors. The base model, the GT, the GTU that had a body kit on it, and they all had the 3.1-liter V6, and then there was the GTZ that had a high output 4-cylinder. The problem is Chevrolet's quality back then. The interiors were absolute garbage. The cars routinely overheated because they had bad heater cores. But people have asked me why I think those cars don't exist anymore and why we don't see them on the roads. Well, I would have to say a lot of it is because of three main factors. Number one, the quality control was not really very good with some of these cars. The metal was thinned out. The interiors were full of plastics that just were brittle and broke. But one of the biggest factors that caused those cars, two of them. Number one, in the 90s, it was a huge trend for cars to have no grill. And with no grill comes no air. The way they did it was they wanted to style the cars to be more aerodynamic. So they would close the grill off and put a panel in its place. And then under the bumper, they would put a plastic piece that actually would duct the air into the radiator. Now, lots of us have gone to a department store or to the mall and seen somebody pull up to a curb too far to where their bumper is hanging on over the curb. Well, what happens when you do that and you literally break that plastic piece under your car? Well, then your car will start to overheat because it's not going to get air any other way. And a lot of those cars overheated like crazy. The other problem was cars were not engineered very well in the 90s because they were trying to do new things. A lot of the Japanese sports cars had 6-cylinder motors with 2 turbochargers crammed into a really small space. And once those turbos started cooking and getting really hot, of course the engine got hot. And then, unlike the old days when you had an old 70s square body Chevy truck and it started to overheat, you had a little bit of time to get to the side of the road and get the hood up and, save your engine. But these aluminum block, aluminum head engines with 2 big turbochargers, no air movement, once they overheated, that was it. You didn't have any real shot to get it to stop, and you would blow a head gasket. The Auroras had one of GM's worst 8-cylinder motors they ever built, called the North Star motors. And if any of you know cars, you know the North Star engine was notorious for head gasket failure. When they built the motor, they built it in a way that, as you know, with an engine, there's the block of the engine and then there's the head, and they come together. Well, the head bolts would back out of the aluminum block, and then what would happen is you'd blow a head gasket. And notorious, almost every North Star engine went out that way, blowing a head gasket. Same thing with the Dodge Neon. They just weren't engineered very well, because when you look at a 4-cylinder engine and there might be 12 or 14 head bolts all the way around, the brackets where they hung the AC compressor and the power steering pump and the alternator took up a spot on the corner of the engine. So what they did was that one bolt was shortened. So what happened when the car was in high RPMs and the motor was bouncing up and down on the motor mounts, that bolt would come up and cause those motors to blow a head gasket. So in a lot of ways, it's quality control for the materials that they used, and it's bad engineering. But the biggest thing that I can think of, in all honesty, was the way they were building them, where even if they had a grill, it was tiny. Well, if you notice today, you don't see cars built without a grill. You just don't see that anymore, because if your car were to start to overheat, you need to have some airflow into the motor, and you need to have a setup so that if your mom or your grandma pulls up at the coffee shop and doesn't they drive up over the curb a little bit, you don't end up breaking that piece of plastic and then no more cooling. Well, I remember people buying Grand Ams and Berettas and Luminas and like the mid-90s Ford Tauruses were notorious because they were flat on the front end. They would buy those cars, and the first thing you would do to make sure, if you bought a car on Craigslist, that you weren't getting scammed was you went to smell antifreeze, and a lot of them would sell it with a little switch on the dashboard, and it's because they would wire the coolant fans so that you could just have them running constantly. Well, those were signs that those cars would overheat. So if you were to ask me why you don't see some of these cars anymore, I mean, there was no quality control. So these cars rusted to pieces, or the interiors fell apart, or they just overheated because of the designs. So I think looking at cars today, we've come a long way, and I think we've passed that point in our lives where cars are able to be sold to where they rust away within 4 or 5 years. Well, if you have any cars or anything from the 90s that you remember that you don't see anymore, write it down in the comments. Let me know what you think. All right, thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you next time.